Imagine waking up one morning to find that your job has disappeared, replaced by workers on the other side of the world. Your family and community are struggling to stay afloat. Everyone you know is living paycheck to paycheck, and politicians seem out of touch, mired in scandal and focused on problems far removed from your reality. Unfortunately, this is not a dystopian movie. For millions of people around the world, this has gradually become reality over the last few decades. It is in this context that a framework like populism has gained ground. Populist leaders tend to rise to power following economic crises and shifting cultural norms. Amid these circumstances and varied geographic landscapes, their promises often remain the same: to dismantle the status quo, break down corrupt political structures, and return power to the real people. Given the global political shifts today, it's crucial to examine how populism is reshaping modern democracies, and how leaders like Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro, and Viktor Orbán have risen to power in ways once considered unimaginable. Populism often emerges from a desire to reshape society. But it doesn't just reshape, it can often obliterate. One key way populist movements rise is by creating a stark binary divide: the virtuous people versus the corrupt elite. This framing appeals to those already alienated by a government that seems unresponsive to their needs. The US is a prime example. In the last 2 decades, the country lost around 5 million manufacturing jobs as factories relocated overseas. This shift devastated communities, particularly in regions like Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Many Americans felt abandoned as globalization hollowed out local industries, creating fertile ground for populist rhetoric. But before we move forward, if you feel like our content is providing you with some value, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for newly uploaded geopolitical content posted every week. By subscribing, you help our team immensely. Now, back to the stuff you came here for. Donald Trump capitalized on this sense of abandonment. His rhetoric often targeted trade deals like NAFTA, blaming these deals and the politicians that supported them for the loss of American jobs. He positioned himself as the champion of the forgotten working class, despite his own background of wealth and privilege. By rallying against policies that had led to job loss and economic stagnation in certain areas, Trump tapped into deep dissatisfaction, presenting himself as an outsider determined to fight for the real American people. A similar dynamic unfolded in Brazil, where widespread disillusionment with political elites paved the way for Jair Bolsonaro's rise. The Operation Car Wash scandal, which exposed vast corruption involving top political figures and state-run companies, only deepened the public's mistrust. The scandal, which began as an investigation into money laundering, uncovered a $5 billion network of political corruption, leading to the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff and the imprisonment of former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. The fallout, including mass job losses at Petrobras, Brazil's state oil company, left the country vulnerable to Bolsonaro's populist rhetoric. Although he had served in Congress for over 2 decades, Bolsonaro successfully rebranded himself as an anti-corruption outsider. His tough-on-crime stance and promises to restore order resonated with a population frustrated by years of economic turmoil and political scandal. Populism wasn't confined to just one side of the Atlantic, though. In Hungary, Viktor Orbán similarly rose to power by exploiting the public's frustrations with the European Union. He spotted a country eager enough to break free from the ever-controlling European Union and its unpopular policies. Hungary's battle with the European Union began in 2012, and it centered on disagreements over democratic standards, migration policies, and financial accountability. The flare-ups began when the EU objected to Hungary's forced leadership changes in state institutions, citing infringement of the rule of law. When Prime Minister Viktor Orbán outlined his vision of an illiberal democracy in 2014, the ideological divide widened. The 2015 European immigration crisis became a decisive moment for Hungarian politics. In fierce opposition to the EU's refugee distribution quotas, The Hungarian government increased border security and emphasised national sovereignty. Defiance of Germany's migrant-friendly stance established Hungary as a vocal and fierce opponent of liberal EU migration policy. This helped to cement Orbán as a pro-nationalist right-wing populist leader. To make matters even more contentious, in 2018, the EU launched Article 7 proceedings against Hungary for alleged violations of judicial independence and media freedom. Financial pressure mounted as the EU withheld €6.3 billion in subsidies in 2022, pending Hungary's implementation of specific rule of law changes. More recently, Hungary's neutrality in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, as well as its policies on migration and LGBTQ rights, have exacerbated tensions between Orbán's Hungary and the EU. With €49 billion allocated under the EU's 2021 to 2027 budget, Hungary remains economically entangled with the EU. But it appears that Orbán will seize any opportunity to differentiate himself from the rest of the EU. And this is the very foundation of Viktor Orbán's populist appeal. Populist leaders are often elected based more on their personalities than their policy proposals. They present themselves as champions of change, but in doing so, they often undermine democratic norms and checks and balances. This process, known as democratic backsliding, occurs gradually as populists erode the systems that sustain democratic institutions. There's another key tactic to populist rhetoric that cannot be ignored. With populism, there is always a clear-cut villain. A simple story to follow, if you will. In the United States, Trump has casted immigrants as the reason for modern American pain. According to a 2015 Pew Research poll, 56% of Americans believed immigrants were taking jobs and social services. By positioning immigration as a national crisis, Trump tapped into anxiety, creating a villain to rally against. In Brazil, Bolsonaro chose criminals as the villains. Crime is indeed a significant issue in Brazil, where the homicide rate in 2017 surpassed 30 per 100,000 people. Bolsonaro's tough rhetoric, including his promise to arm good citizens, resonated with those desperate for safety. However, he framed criminals as the root cause of all of Brazil's societal issues, rather than viewing crime as a symptom of broader systemic problems. As for Hungary's Viktor Orbán, he, similar to Trump, chose immigrants as his villain. During the 2015 migration crisis, the Hungarian government built a razor-wire fence and launched anti-immigrant campaigns, including billboards urging refugees not to take jobs away from Hungarians. But the signs were all in the Hungarian language, so arguably a very strategic and effective bit of political theatre. Populist leaders frequently attack the media, portraying it as an enemy of the people. Trump, Bolsonaro, and Orbán all employed this tactic, positioning the mainstream press as antagonistic to the real citizens of their countries. Trump's constant attacks of the media, calling outlets like CNN fake news and journalists enemies of the people, delegitimized any negative coverage. By 2020, 90% of Republicans reported distrust in the media, a direct result of Trump's sustained rhetoric. Bolsonaro's relationship with the press was similarly hostile. He dismissed critical coverage as fake news and used social media to bypass traditional outlets. WhatsApp, in particular, became a vital tool for spreading his message, often blurring the lines between fact and fiction. Orbán took a more systematic approach. Since coming to power, his government has systematically weakened Hungary's independent media. Reporters Without Borders now ranks Hungary 92nd in press freedom, down from 23rd in 2010. Populist leaders thrive on narrative control. turning their personalities into central pillars of their political movements. Trump, for example, presented himself as a billionaire outsider who understood the struggles of ordinary Americans despite his immense familial wealth. His rallies became spectacles centered on his persona rather than substantive policy debates. Bolsonaro, too, crafted a narrative of toughness and resilience. A knife attack during his 2018 campaign became a defining moment, with his recovery image symbolizing his endurance and appeal as a leader who could withstand any challenge. Orbán's narrative, though quieter, is equally effective. He casts himself as a protector of Hungary's traditional values, using historical references to bolster his legitimacy. This sense of continuity with the past has helped him maintain a loyal following. Populism also tends to centralize power in the hands of a single leader, undermining the democratic principle of the peaceful transfer of power. Trump's refusal to accept the 2020 election results and his subsequent encouragement of a violent Capitol Hill insurrection marked a breaking point in American democracy. His actions fueled a fervent loyalty, led to the first non-peaceful transfer of power in US history. Similarly, Orbán's concentration of power has undermined Hungary's democratic institutions. His government has been accused of weakening judicial independence, curbing press freedom, and dismantling checks and balances. Critics argue that Hungary has become an illiberal democracy, where elections exist, but real competition is absent. Despite the challenges populism poses to democratic norms, it can also highlight deeply felt grievances about economic inequality, political corruption, and cultural alienation, issues that traditional parties often overlook. Some argue that populism is a necessary force in today's political landscape, forcing societies to confront uncomfortable and inconvenient truths. Populist leaders draw attention to legitimate concerns, such as crime in Brazil and the economic costs of immigration in the US and the EU. However, their proposed solutions often exacerbate division, relying on racial undertones and scapegoating. The central question for democracies is whether they can address these legitimate grievances without compromising core democratic values. Populism is unlikely to fade. If anything, its success suggests it is filling a vacuum left by mainstream politics. How will democratic norms evolve in response to populism? Is rapid societal change worth the price of democratic backsliding?